Welcome to AP European History with Dr. Brovkin. Today we continue to talk about World War I, La Grande Guerre. And today we actually begin to discuss the beginning of the war and the first 2 years of the war and how it went on the Western Front. Now, there's so much material about this. There are dozens and dozens and dozens of movies, documentaries, books. It's extremely difficult to say anything new about this complex subject. So what I'll try to do is just go over the major events and give a little bit of an interpretation as to why things went the way they did and what people thought at that time about what was going on. So as we just discussed, in the first days of August, all these countries declared war on each other. But what it actually, from the declaring of the war to the beginning of what is called hostilities or military action, there's some lag time because they need what is called mobilization. Now, mobilization is a process when the resources are pulled in together to the front line. It is not like now that you press the button and the missiles fly and destroy the world in a matter of 10 minutes. No, in order to start military action, you have to engage a huge machinery of state, of bringing hundreds of thousands of people to the front line, where they actually confront the enemy in a line. A defense line at that time, at the beginning of the war, is obviously the border. So there were two what is called theaters of war, the Eastern Front and the Western Front. The Eastern Front, you would see my video, which is called Russia in World War I, where I discuss the very, very first days in East Prussia and the Russian offensive. But today we're focused on the Western Front. What needs to be said immediately is that in the Western Front, there was a plan that you are all familiar with, and it's called the Schlieffen Plan. The Schlieffen Plan was worked out way back in the 1890s by General Schlieffen under the General Staff under Moltke, the famous German military staff. Now, the Schlieffen Plan was quite simple, and it was a good plan from a purely military point of view. It called for swift action across Belgium, surrounding the French army and reaching Paris. Now, if you look at the map and the arrows that show the Schlieffen Plan, you would see that the border between France and Germany, the direct border in Alsace-Lorraine, is mountainous. So there was not a good action for the infantry to go. Further north in Luxembourg, it begins to slope down. And once you come to Belgium, that territory becomes flat land. And that's very convenient for military action. So the Germans had to weigh two possibilities. On the one hand, you move fast through Belgium, but that means you violate Belgium's neutrality. But then you get to Paris fast. Or you can go slow through Alsace-Lorraine. You do not violate the Belgian territory, and that means that the British do not have to come into the war. They have the alliance with France, but they're not obligated to come to it, and the only time they're obligated is if Belgian neutrality is violated. Now, the British invented this kind of a propaganda ploy, which goes like this. They had to invent a ploy, which sounds like this. If the Germans occupy Belgium, that is the same as holding a pistol directed at the head of Britain. Now, it's a very nice imagery. You have this Germany holding a pistol, and then, everybody thinks, yeah, that's totally wrong. Germany should not help Belgium. But in fact, it's a ploy. It's nothing like that at all. Because if the Germans occupy Belgium, they're just about 100 kilometers closer to Calais, to Ostende, the shortest crossing across La Manche, as it is from Germany itself. So it is a little closer, but you still have to cross the English Channel or La Manche, and it's not easy to do. You have to have a powerful fleet, and the British fleet is powerful enough to stop any aggression against Britain that could place. In other words, it's a propaganda ploy. The vital security of Great Britain was not endangered with the German takeover of Belgium. Nevertheless, the Germans knew that if they crossed into Belgium, the British would come in. And they waited and they thought, okay, well, that's okay too. Well, let them come in then. By that time, we will be in Paris. In other words, the Schlieffen Plan had to be executed exactly as planned. In a matter of 2 weeks, you have to seize Paris, and then the British would have come too late. But the downside of this plan is that if you don't, you're stuck. The British would come, you do not defeat the French army, you do not take Paris, and then you wind up in a stalemate. And that is exactly what happened. So that brings us a very good question. Why did the Schlieffen Plan not work? It was a good plan. They did move across the flatlands of Belgium, and they moved pretty fast. And then it needs to be serious research into the interaction of the German military to understand why the Schlieffen Plan didn't work. I did that research. I was focusing on German history at some point in the past. And here is the brief explanation as to why the Schlieffen Plan didn't work. Number one, the current German commanders did not like the Schlieffen Plan. But they had to follow somebody else's plan, which of course a bad beginning. Number two, the Kaiser was commander-in-chief officially, but in fact, the general staff of the German army perceived the Kaiser as a kind of a nuisance who interfered in something he shouldn't. He was at the front line, and he did give all kinds of advice and interfered into the actions, and nobody could say to him. And so at several crucial points, time was wasted to try to counter-command what he said, and it was very destructive for the unity of the German command. The third thing was something unpredictable, which happens all the time. It's the weather. It's the way the army units advance. They were not advancing as fast as was prescribed. They were pretty fast. They were the fastest ever, but that's not fast enough. So in other words, if you look at the map, they did cover pretty much the distance to the Marne, which is a river, and the closest they come up to is 40 kilometers to Paris. That's not bad. I mean, this is actually a very serious military feat. They managed to come to 40 kilometers from France. But that's not good enough. They have not captured France. They have not encircled the French army, which was still capable of action, and they were, most importantly, they failed in separating the British army and the French army. Now, even without Paris, even without encircling the French army, if they had managed to break through to the coast and seize Calais, that would mean separating the British and the French, and that would have been a very favorable situation for them, which they could have used perhaps to win the war. But they failed in all three objectives. They failed to take Paris, they failed to encircle French army, and they failed to separate the British from the French, which had a continuous line of defenses, and therefore the Schlieffen Plan failed. It failed in a sense that it was not accomplished. The Germans were still in a by far more advantageous position because they were on French territory, and they were deep into French territory. They occupied most of Belgium, and they were 40 kilometers from Paris. Nevertheless, that was the end of the campaign. The line is called the Marne, the Battle of the Marne #1. It would stay like this for 2.5 years. It would be a stationary position war, as it was called, with trenches. Nothing would change on the Western Front in this particular area for a very, very long time, until another battle that would shake the French to their very core, that would be called the Battle of the Marne. Now, before we discuss the Battle of Verdun, before we discuss the Battle of Verdun, one thing that is extremely important to underscore here is the degree to which people didn't know what was going on. We today are so conditioned that we instantaneously know from fake news or real news or whatever news you want, but we do know. We have instantaneous situation that is reported to us in the sources that we prefer. Now, what to me is so amazing is that the news was so pack of lies and propaganda. Nobody actually knew what was going on at the front. You had tightly controlled news machinery that delivered propaganda lies. The first day of the battle went pretty well for the English army, and that is when they lost 100,000 men. Unbelievable lies and disinformation, the fear to admit the defeats on both sides. The Germans were highlighting all their successes and how much they brought into French territory, but they never really said, oh, you know what, the Schieffen Plan failed. Nobody dared to say that. The same thing with the French. They were retreating, but they never really admitted it until 2 or 3 weeks later. So that's one of the most astounding things, is the lack of information, the control of the information, and the pack of lies and propaganda that you see in the newspapers of the time. Another important thing about the first phase of the war is that nobody really knew what they were getting into. And that to me is kind of amazing. You have professional soldiers who for years and years were studying their subject, the war, and yet they didn't know it. I mean, to me it sounds astounding. I study history and I'm supposed to be a professional and I'm supposed to know what I study, and I do. These people were studying war as their profession, and they had no clue what modern warfare was like. And when the war started, it was astonishing that they had no idea what's going on. I mean, they thought in terms of the Prussian-French War of 1870, when you shoot one shot at a time, and when you have waves of soldiers coming over and doing hand-to-hand combat. They were absolutely astounding. What now, when you have a wave of attack, they're mowed down by machine guns. Now, didn't you know, guys, that there was a machine gun invented? I mean, why do you send hundreds of thousands of people to die facing machine guns? They never answered that question. They kept on fighting as if machine gun didn't exist. And they were sending waves and waves, and these countless documents that we have, against machine guns. People without armor. Like in the Middle Ages, they had armor, and all they could do is cut that with their sword or whatever. Now you have guys in just shirts sent on the lines with machine gun that kills them instantly. Hundreds of thousands of them. That is close to madness or idiocy or irresponsibility that falls on the generals and army staff of all belligerent countries, specifically France, Britain, and Germany. Now, machine gun is number one, but then they came up in 1915 with another one, which is poison gas. And of course, at first they had no masks against it. And in 1917, they came up with a tank, which was not very effective and moved very slowly, so I don't think it really mattered that much. Machine gun was it. That was the weapon that mowed down hundreds of thousands, and is probably the most effective and most fearsome weapon of World War I. Now, finally, the attitudes in the first round of the war. The attitudes were, we'll be home for Christmas. That's like in all British newspapers. Nobody took this war seriously. Nobody knew what they were getting into. The generals, the public, the soldiers. It is so sad to read those letters, full of patriotism and poetry, full of patriotism of English soldiers, Canadian soldiers, Australian soldiers who volunteered, quote, to defend Britain. To defend from whom? From Germany. The Germans were not going to attack Britain. Everybody knew that. The British sent them into Belgium because they feared the might of Germany. In other words, it was their decision to fight on the continent and mow down hundreds of thousands of English, Canadian, and Australian soldiers in totally unprepared, totally unknowing what they were doing, lying to their publics, and destroying so many young lives. Now, it is very pathetic to read those those enthusiastic, patriotic poetry, some of which your literature teacher gave you last year, about defending England and standing up to the enemy, but in fact it was basically the stupidity of their generals that sent them to their death on the fields of Belgium. And on that note, I should stop the first phase of the war, 1914, and then we will face the two most dramatic and most vicious and most bloody battles, the battles of Verdun and the Battle of the Somme on the Western Front in the next year, 1915-1916. Thank you very much, and don't forget to subscribe to AP European History with Dr. Brovkin.